Welcome to our weekend Bible study. We begin a brand new series today, and we will be studying the characteristics of the fruit of the Spirit. And I want to start today with love. That's one of them, and the first one listed in the text. Start with this story. Who gets married on a Tuesday? And that's what family and friends of Kim and Scotty Madison wondered when they opened their invitations to the couple's Tuesday wedding. Kim lived in Nashville. She had raised her 5 children there after a tough divorce. Scotty was also divorced. He traveled to Nashville often on business. Kim said, when I was navigating the dating world after my divorce, my preacher said, Kim, the right man for you is the one who would be serving the homeless, whether you are or not. And sure enough, the night Scotty traveled to Nashville to ask Kim to consider dating him seriously was also the night that she had committed to attending a midweek worship at the Nashville Women's Mission. And she said yes to the date, on the condition that Scotty join her at the mission. Well, he agreed. And that night he stood up, he gave a devotional, spoke from his heart. That was quite unexpected, I think, but not that he would speak from his heart, but that he stood up to give kind of a testimony, a devotional, and he told about losing his son to heroin and about living a strong life in the aftermath of such a tragedy. He really shared and opened up his heart and spoke to the women at the shelter. And Kim said, I heard his heart for Jesus, and I saw his desire to serve others. I knew that right that night, God wanted us to be together. Well, not long after that night, they were invited to volunteer at the Bridge Ministry, which is a ministry in downtown Nashville where many homeless live and congregate underneath a major bridge there in town. So they call it the Bridge Ministry. Scotty said this was a sector of our society I used to look through and around. By Christmas, Scotty made it clear he wanted to marry Kim, and she felt the same way about him. Over the following month, they prayed and prayed and prayed about God's timing for the wedding, about the details involved and how they were going to do this. Well, Scotty said with a smile it was a real destination wedding. We shared it with our special guests, those whom Jesus wanted invited to the wedding banquet, the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind. Kim said we'd reached a point in our lives where we recognized Christ's love is centered around serving. She said we wanted our friends and family to know and to hear, this is who we are. Will you now serve alongside us? So on May 9, 2017, they gathered with their guests, including more than 200 of their homeless friends underneath the bridge. And everyone enjoyed an amazing meal and a worship service and a wedding. Knowing that to the homeless a slice of wedding cake meant that they were truly guests who mattered, Kim and Scotty made sure everyone had all the cake they wanted. When Kim and Scotty were pronounced man and wife, they went down every aisle and greeted their guests individually. Now, no one who attended that wedding left unmoved or unchanged. It was quite the celebration. Why? Well, let's ask the question. Since we're talking about this characteristic of the fruit of the Spirit called love, what is love? I mean, is there a more complex word than love? I don't think so. We talk about loving God, loving football, receiving love, giving love. We talk about love in so many different ways. And then we get in the car and head home, with the radio on and listening to songs about love. Selfish, self-centered love, one-sided, hopeless love. And once in a while, we will hear a song about a mature, other-centered love that stands the test of time. All of these different aspects that describe what we call love. No wonder we take the word love for granted. We're obsessed with it. And yet rarely do we witness it or hear what truly love is in the world around us, because the world doesn't know what love is. It doesn't understand it. If true love is so unfamiliar, why do people write and talk and sing about it so much? Well, because there's a hole in the human heart. We're desperate for the we are desperate for the experience of real love. Within intimate relationships and in our daily interactions with others, everyone needs reassurance, needs affection. We all need real, genuine love. Now, the Bible has a whole lot to say about it. In the New International Version of the Bible, the word love occurs 567 times. From the book of Genesis to the book of Revelation, the Bible is a story of love. It's God's unconditional and relentless love for us, mankind. Love is the foundation of everything good. Quite simply, love is what makes every other part of life amazingly possible. The love that appears at the top of almost every list of virtues in the Bible is not just about God's love for us, though. It's also about our love for one another. To become a Christian means the very love of God is poured into your heart. If you're a Christian, you have the gift of the Spirit. You have the fruit of the Spirit. And one of these characteristics of this fruit of the Spirit is love. This love isn't just a spiritual sensation. This love wears work gloves, and it handles the everyday nuts and bolts of life. It's very practical. It hugs the lonely, feeds the hungry, comforts the sorrowful, puts up with the unsufferable. Oh, but let's take a look at real love. You see, until Jesus came to earth, we didn't know what it was. This kind of love was unknown. The love known as agape, it's unconditional, divine love. The kind of love that God exercises toward us. Most of us know the story of Disney's Beauty and the Beast, but you may have not considered the kind of love it describes. It's a wonderful, familiar example of God's agape love for us, the highest form of love. We have been made unlovely by sin, just like the beast was made unlovely by a curse. And yet God's love sees beneath it. He sees the person that He created. Just like, I think her name was Belle, saw through the ugliness of the beast to the person he really was underneath. When we open ourselves up to His love, it transforms us back into what we were meant to be, just like the story. Well, wouldn't it be amazing if Christians were as obsessed with God's kind of love as the world is with its brand of love? Well, today we're going to learn much about God's love for us, and we'll see how God's love for us is key to us loving each other. Now, I won't take a whole bunch of your time, but if you would, let's study this thing called love. First of all, it's a command. I heard about a teenager who was asked what she thought love was. This was her answer. Love is the feeling you feel when you feel that what you feel is a feeling you never felt before. That's kind of a teenager's definition of love. That's how most of us think about love, because the world, the culture around us has trained us that way. A feeling. That's what we associate with love. A feeling is something that just happens to us, brought on by circumstances beyond our control. We can't help who we love. That's what the world tells us. But in the Bible, love isn't just a feeling. In fact, it rarely is a feeling. It's not just one option among many feelings. Over and over in the New Testament, God's people are commanded to love. In different contexts, in different settings. As adults, as children, all age groups, commanded to love. And on 13 occasions, Christians are commanded to love each other. Why is that? We shouldn't have to be commanded to love our brothers and sisters in Christ. We're family. It should just come naturally, right? Who would really know if we didn't love one another? I mean, who would really know? Well, God would, number one. But the Bible also tells us the world will know if you don't love each other. The world is watching us. They're waiting to see if this Jesus thing really makes a difference. So how do we know? How do you know if you're truly loving one another? Well, the world tells you all the time, just follow your heart. And what they really mean is follow your feelings. But God's kind of love, agape love, doesn't follow anything. It leads. It leads by example. Love is a verb, you see. It acts. It leads our hearts. It changes our lives. Oh, and it's hard work. The concept of love poses a major question for us who, as Christians, those of us who follow Christ. Christians are called to activate love with determination and diligence. The question is how? Paul summarized his description in 1 Corinthians 13. We know that well. I'm not going to take the time to go through all of that because I think you know it. But did you know the first verses of chapter 14? The first two words of chapter 14, in fact. Do you know what they are? After talking about and describing love in 1 Corinthians 13, the first two words of 1 Corinthians 14, pursue love. Two simple words that summarize one of the toughest assignments that we've been given as followers of Christ. Pursue love. I'm reading from Ray Stedman in an article called The One Commandment from Authentic Christianity. He says, loving people is about the most difficult thing that some of us can do. We can be patient with people and even just. But how are we supposed to conjure up in our hearts that warm, effervescent, sentimental of goodwill, which the New Testament calls love? Some people are so miserably unlovable. That odorous person with the nasty cough that sat next to you, shoving his newspaper in your face. Those crude louts in the neighborhood with the barking dog. Oh, some people are just hard to love, aren't they? But the commandment is not ambiguous. It's crystal clear. We are called, we are commanded to love. Philip Kennison, in Life on the Vine, says, here we have a prime example of that seeming paradox that stands at the center of the Christian life. The fruit is always a gift, but it still requires hard work. Yeah, this characteristic of the fruit of the Spirit, it's been given to us as Christians as a gift, but truly, it requires hard work. Love is a gift and a task. What is the work that we need to do to love? Well, Paul said, 1 Corinthians 4, verse 1, pursue it. Pursue genuine love, not the feeling, the real thing. When we receive God's love in our hearts, it creates a reservoir of love that we can draw from to love others. In other words, we love others with the same love with which we ourselves have been loved. It becomes a cycle. God loves us, we take that and love others. And that reservoir of love is pure. And when we do the first things and act as if we love, it fills our heart more. The reservoir just keeps filling up. The more we love, the more love we have. With tongue in cheek, Ray Ortlund wrote these words, the beautiful one another commands of the New Testament are famous. For example, sanctify one another, humble one another, pressure one another, embarrass one another, interrupt one another, defeat one another, shame one another, marginalize one another, judge one another, run one another's lives, Our relationship with one another reveals to us what we really believe as opposed to what we think we believe. Our convictions as opposed to our opinions. Obviously, love is difficult. And it was tough for the first century Christians as well. They had an issue with love, or it wouldn't have been written about so much. On October 22nd, 2007, the first Medal of Honor was awarded for combat in Afghanistan. Just this week, I was at home with the stay-at-home orders and watching a movie called Lone Survivor. It tells the story, so I'm not going to go into great detail because maybe you've seen the movie. In June 2005, a Navy SEAL by the name of Murphy was sent on a mission. He and 3 other SEALs. They're in the rugged Afghan mountains to search for a known terrorist. They encountered some local tribesmen, and the tribesmen reported them to the Taliban. Well, pretty soon they're surrounded. And Murphy moves from man to man to keep his men together, to keep his team together. He had to expose himself to enemy fire to do so. And then because of the mountainous terrain, they couldn't communicate. The communications were blocked. So he made the decision to move out into an open area to call for help. One of the SEALs was Petty Officer Luttrell. He survived the firestorm because he was blasted over a ridge by a rocket-propelled grenade, and he was knocked unconscious. When he came to, he hid in a crevice in a rock. He staunched his bleeding wounds with mud. Marcus Luttrell came home determined to tell the story of that day. And he told it, and they made a movie about it. Well, there's only one symbol I know greater than the Medal of Honor, and that is the cross of Calvary. They're both about love. Only when we understand how much God has loved us will we be able to love one another. We've been commanded to do it, but it isn't until you can understand how much you've been loved that you can fulfill that command. God calls us to imitate Him and how He loves us. Ephesians 5, beginning with verse 1, be imitators of God as dear children. Walk in love, as Christ also has loved us, given Himself for us. One of the most productive things we can do to pursue this kind of lifestyle is to read Paul's prayers for the churches that he was involved with. He didn't pray for greater attendance. He didn't pray for bigger offerings. When you look at his prayers for those churches, you discover something far more challenging. For example, he prayed this about the church in Ephesus. Ephesians 3, beginning with verse 16. He prayed that He would grant you, according to the riches of His glory, to be strengthened with might through His Spirit in the inner man, that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may be able to comprehend with all the saints what is the width and length and height, to know the love of Christ which passes knowledge, that you may be filled with the fullness of God. In 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 1, Paul tells us to imitate him. And we should be praying about greater love for each other as well. You know, like Paul prayed for those churches to have more of God's love and Christ's love. We should imitate that and pray for it for each other and for ourselves. Having been a preacher for almost 35 years, I can also promise you there will be people all the time who will really test your ability to love. Oh, some people are just harder to love than others. One time I was in the drive-thru line at McDonald's, and I didn't realize when I was pulling into line that I had cut someone off. It was a lady. And when she rolled down her window and started swearing at me, I was clued in. I had done something to upset her. I got the message loud and clear. Some people are just hard to love. We all know what it's like to be yelled at furiously for something we did accidentally. Well, the Bible says, when others treat you badly, love them. Pray for them. Do good things to them. Love your enemy, it says. Difficult, Unpleasant people are one thing, but my enemy, love them too? Oh, it may be one of the most difficult things we're called to do in this life. But Jesus very clearly commands us to love our enemies. Matthew 5, beginning with verse 43. You've heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. Well, if you're still in doubt that love is an action, not a feeling, this should prove it to you. Take note of this verse. Jesus says, love your enemies. Then he tells us how. Bless them. Do good to them. Pray for them. That's how you love your enemy. To the natural mind, that seems like, I don't know, that's taking a step too far. But this is truly where we have to be kind to ourselves, and we have to be very clear about what God is asking us to do. We're not asked to abandon our feelings. We're asked to bless someone and to pray for them and to do good to them as God is working on them and through me to love them. We're not asked to expose ourselves or others to these people, but to pray for them, to bless them, to do good to them. Oh, but that's an enormous task. It may even seem impossible. And that's why we have examples in the Bible of people obeying this command. And the greatest example is Jesus himself. He gave up his life on the cross for the very people who were demanding and performing his execution. Then saying, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. Luke 23:34. And do you remember Stephen? He's being stoned to death for preaching the gospel. He also asks God to forgive his executioners. In Acts 7 and verse 60, he knelt down, cried out with a loud voice, Lord, do not charge them with this sin. During the American Revolution, a preacher named Peter Miller was opposed and humiliated by Michael Whitman. Michael Whitman was an evil-minded man, and he did all he could to suppress the gospel. One day, Mr. Whitman was arrested for treason and sentenced to die. And rather than breathe a sigh of relief at the news, Peter Miller, the preacher, traveled 70 miles on foot to plead for his enemy's life. When General George Washington first listened to the plea, he told Miller that he would not grant the life of his friend. And at that, the preacher leaped to his feet and said, my friend, he is my bitterest enemy. Washington changed his mind and granted a pardon. Peter Miller was doing exactly what Jesus called us to do. One reason that people give for withholding love from others is they don't want to get hurt. It hurts too much to love. They talk about the times when they tried it and they were hurt because they did it. Well, if you've experienced rejection or you've walked through it with others, I understand your determination never to risk it, never to let it happen again. But listen to this before you make your final decision. To love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything, and you're certainly going to be wrung out and possibly broken. In 2009, Lisa Finn was an ESPN Features television producer looking for a good story when she came across D'Artagnan Crockett. He's a top high school wrestling talent, a winner in multiple classes. D'Artagnan was also homeless and legally blind. And when Lisa met him, he subsisted on the soggy mozzarella sticks and bruised apples that he could find and eat in the cafeteria at school. And that was it. Perched on D'Artagnan's back, yes, riding on his back, was his best friend and wrestling teammate, Leroy Sutton. And they were both homeless. Lisa filmed the two boys in their world for 5 months. She got to know them very well. Her efforts paid off because viewers around the world took the boys into their hearts after they watched that special. And that's when love took over. Lisa personally responded to nearly 1,000 emails. She managed donations. She managed college visits, all while ensuring that D'Artagnan and Leroy were fed on a daily basis, more than just lunch at school. The generosity of ESPN viewers made it possible for Leroy to move to Arizona, where he studied video game design at Collins College. He was the first in his family to graduate high school and then to graduate college. And the attention brought D'Artagnan a different kind of training. In March of 2010, coaches invited him to live at the Olympic Training Center in Colorado Springs, where he would learn the Paralympic sport of judo. Now remember, he's blind, so it's not the Olympics, it's Paralympics. But there he would have shelter. He would have sport. He would have school and Medicare. And he would proudly show Lisa his very first, very own bed. Against the odds, D'Artagnan earned a spot on the 2012 Paralympic team, and he went to the London Paralympics. As he stood on the medal stand, he won a bronze medal. He said, "Things like this don't happen to kids like me." His face was beaming, with a bronze medal around his neck. Lisa would later say in the special, "He's right." Now, why did she stay in those boys' lives? Oh, it goes on and on. It'll just break your heart about a time she took D'Artagnan to the eye doctor. And in filling out the forms, because she would be she would need medical records, access to them for the TV show and all of that. And he filled out the forms, and in relationship to him, as regards to her, he put guardian angel. And the administrator called later to tell her, "You need to see what he wrote about you." Well, she stayed in their lives when she very easily could have moved on. She cared for them and made sure that they were well, and so on and so forth. She stayed because she loved them. We learn to love one step at a time, just like we learn to walk. We learn to love one loving act at a time. You can't become loving by doing gigantic acts of love. That's not how it's done. We learn to love by incorporating love into all the little things that we do. 1 Corinthians 16:14, "Let all that you do be done with love." We think giving our all to the Lord is like taking $1,000 and putting it on the table and laying it there and saying, here's my life, Lord. I'm giving you my all. But the reality for most of us is he sends us to the bank and says, change all of those bills into quarters. And we go through life putting out 25 cents here, 50 cents there, just small increments of love here and there. Listening to the neighbor kid's troubles instead of saying, get lost. Usually giving our life to Christ isn't glorious. It isn't something that's this big, huge, glorious celebration. It's just a small act of love. We'd rather just do one big thing and get it over with, but he calls us and gifts us with this fruit to do these small acts of love constantly. 1 John 4:7. Beloved, let us love one another, and everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. Love. Next week, joy. See you then.